Love, trust, and betrayal, three forces that can either build a family or shatter it beyond repair. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where secrets are whispered behind closed doors, a newlywed couple seemed to have it all: a fresh start, a promising future, and a marriage full of hope. But beneath the surface of wedded bliss lurked a hidden obsession, a temptation so dangerous that it would unravel their world in ways no one could have imagined. This is the story of a young wife whose darkest desires led her down a path of deception, manipulation, and ultimately a horrifying crime that would leave an entire family in ruins. Meet Emily Carter, beautiful, charming, and freshly married to the love of her life, Daniel. To outsiders, she was the picture of devotion, the perfect wife in a fairy tale romance. But what no one knew was that she harbored a secret she could never confess, one that involved a man far too close for comfort. Enter Richard Carter, Daniel's father, a powerful, enigmatic figure who carried himself with the kind of confidence that only came with age and experience. A man who had spent years building a legacy, a family, and a reputation that demanded respect. Yet behind his composed exterior, Richard was playing a dangerous game of his own, one that would shatter every boundary of morality. It started with stolen glances across the dinner table, a lingering touch that lasted just a second too long, a tension that neither of them acknowledged but neither could resist. What began as an unspoken attraction soon spiraled into something far more reckless, far more forbidden. Their secret meetings, their whispered promises, their reckless indulgence, it all became an addiction. But in a house built on lies, the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. And when Daniel started to notice the way his wife's eyes lingered on his father, the way her excuses grew more frequent, the way Richard's demeanor subtly shifted around her, suspicion began to take root. What no one could predict was how this twisted love triangle would take a nightmarish turn, one that would end in blood, betrayal, and a crime so brutal it would make national headlines. But before the truth could come out, before justice could be served, one of them would pay the ultimate price. The question is who? And how did it all spiral so far out of control? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling details of a love affair gone terribly, terribly wrong. Emily Carter was never the type to settle for ordinary. Even as a child, she had a restless spirit, always craving more than what life had to offer. Growing up in a small town with modest dreams and predictable routines, she had long envisioned herself living a life of luxury, passion, and excitement. When she met Daniel Carter, she thought she had finally found her way in. He was everything she had been taught to want: a successful, ambitious man with a strong family name and the means to provide her with the comfortable life she had always imagined. Their romance moved fast, swept up in the feverish excitement of new love, and before long, they were exchanging vows in a picture-perfect wedding. To their friends and family, it was a love story worth celebrating. But what no one saw, what even Daniel himself failed to recognize, was the growing hunger inside Emily, a hunger that even marriage couldn't satisfy. At first, she tried to convince herself that what she had was enough. The house was beautiful, her husband was kind, and their life together was stable, almost too stable. Daniel worked long hours, often lost in the pressures of his demanding career, leaving Emily alone for stretches of time that felt endless. At first, she filled the loneliness with shopping, lavish dinners, and the social events that came with being a newlywed in an upper-class circle. But there was only so much empty conversation and forced laughter she could take before the boredom began creeping in like an unwanted guest. And then there was Richard. He was everything Daniel wasn't: bold, confident, dangerously charming in a way that felt effortless. Where Daniel was cautious and methodical, Richard was unpredictable, a man who spoke with authority and carried an aura of experience that Emily found intoxicating. It started with harmless conversation, late-night talks over expensive wine, when Daniel was still at the office. The way Richard's eyes lingered just a second too long, the way his hand would rest on hers. When making a point, it was a slow, careful unraveling, a dance of temptation that neither of them seemed willing to stop. But in a house where secrets were whispered in the dark, suspicion was bound to follow. Daniel, ever the devoted husband, started to notice the small things, the way Emily's demeanor changed when his father entered the room, the way she suddenly seemed preoccupied whenever he mentioned business trips or late meetings. And it wasn't just Daniel. The housekeeper, who had worked for the Carter family for years, found herself growing uneasy with the stolen glances she caught in passing. A neighbor who lived just across the street swore she had seen Emily leaving Richard's guest house late at night, though when pressed, she couldn't be sure. Even Daniel's younger sister, who had always been skeptical of Emily's intentions, felt a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. But suspicion alone wasn't enough, not yet. Then came the first real crack in the illusion. One evening, Daniel arrived home earlier than expected, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, breaking the silence of the night. Inside, Emily and Richard sat too close on the living room couch, their conversation hushed, their faces just a little too tense. Emily's reaction was instant. She jumped to her feet, laughing off the moment as nothing more than a casual chat. But the way Richard's expression darkened, the way his jaw clenched as he reached for his glass of scotch, told a different story. Something had changed that night, a shift in the air that neither of them could ignore. And then, just as quickly as the affair had ignited, everything started to spiral. A late-night phone call from an unknown number. A cryptic note left on the windshield of Emily's car, warning her to be careful. A confrontation between father and son that ended with hushed voices and slammed doors. The once private affair was no longer just theirs to keep. Someone else knew. Someone was watching. And whoever it was, they weren't going to stay silent for long. Then came the night that would change everything. The night that would turn a tangled web of secrets into a scene of unimaginable horror. The night when one of them would take their final breath. But what really happened? Who had the most to lose, and who was desperate enough to kill? The truth was far more twisted than anyone could have expected, and the most shocking part. The real danger had been lurking in the shadows all along. Fear has a strange way of tightening its grip when the truth is just within reach. In the days following that fateful night, the air inside the Carter estate grew thick with unease. The once pristine home, filled with warmth and wealth, now felt like a house of mirrors, each reflection distorted, each corner hiding something unseen. Emily found herself moving cautiously, her heart pounding at every unexpected sound. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the guilt of what had happened was warping her mind. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just her imagination. Someone was trying to keep her from finding out the truth. The first sign came when she discovered Daniel's phone missing from the nightstand. He had always been careful with his belongings, never the type to misplace things, and yet it was gone without a trace. She had seen it just the night before, vibrating with messages he never let her see. At first, she convinced herself he had simply left it at the office, but then the housekeeper mentioned something strange. The security cameras on the property had been tampered with. A full 2-hour window was missing from the previous night's footage, erased as if someone had something to hide. Emily felt her stomach twist. Had Daniel erased them? Had Richard? Or was there someone else involved, someone neither of them had accounted for? Then there was the warning. It came in the form of a handwritten note, slipped under the door while she slept. The message was simple, written in sharp, slanted letters. Stop asking questions. You don't want the answers. A chill ran down her spine as she read the words over and over, her mind racing through the possibilities. Who had left it? And more importantly, what exactly did they not want her to find? She thought about going to Daniel, about confessing everything, the affair, the doubts, the fear that someone was watching. But something held her back. He was keeping secrets of his own, she was sure of it. And if she confronted him, there was no telling how he would react. Then, just when she thought she couldn't take any more uncertainty, another piece of the puzzle surfaced, one she never saw coming. An old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, tucked away inside one of Richard's desk drawers. The headline sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Mysterious death of young woman tied to prominent businessman. No arrests made. The date was from over 2 decades ago, long before she had met Daniel. But the name of the man suspected in the case: Richard Carter. Emily's hands trembled as she scanned the article, reading about a woman who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Her body discovered weeks later in a secluded area. The authorities had ruled it an accident, but whispers of an affair and a cover-up had followed Richard for years before the story eventually faded from the public eye. Had she gotten involved with a man capable of murder? Had history repeated itself, with Emily unknowingly stepping into the same role as the woman before her? The more she pieced together, the more suffocating the fear became. And yet something still wasn't adding up. If Richard had killed before, why would someone be warning her to stop digging? Unless someone else had just as much to lose. Then, just as suddenly as the clues had appeared, something else went missing: Emily's car keys. She knew she had left them on the kitchen counter, but they were gone, vanished like Daniel's phone and the erased security footage. It was a small thing, something that could easily be brushed off as forgetfulness. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something more. Someone was trying to control the situation, to keep her exactly where they wanted her. And then came the final blow, the moment that made her realize she was in far deeper than she ever intended. Late that night, unable to sleep, she stepped outside for air. The wind was sharp against her skin, the street eerily silent. But just as she turned to head back inside, she saw it, faint but undeniable. A figure standing at the edge of the property, watching her. She couldn't see their face, couldn't make out their features, but she felt their gaze like a knife against her skin. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. Emily had thought she was the one pulling the strings, the one weaving a web of secrecy. But now, she knew someone else was in control. And whatever game they were playing, she had just become the pawn. Emily barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that shadowy figure watching her from the edge of the property, standing so still, so deliberate. Whoever they were, they hadn't run when she spotted them. They wanted her to see them. They wanted her to know they were there. When the sun finally rose, she forced herself out of bed, determined to act as if everything were normal. But normal had become a fragile illusion, one that was slipping further away by the second. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. But before she could even decide where to start, something happened that made her blood run cold. Daniel's sister, Vanessa, showed up at the house unannounced, her expression drawn, her movements hesitant. They had never been particularly close. Vanessa had always seen right through Emily's carefully crafted persona. But this morning, she looked more unsettled than skeptical. Without even a greeting, she pulled something from her coat pocket and placed it on the kitchen counter. It was an envelope, the paper slightly crumpled, the edges damp as if it had been held in nervous hands for too long. Emily stared at it, her pulse quickening. "I found this in my car this morning," Vanessa said, her voice low and controlled. But there was a sharpness underneath, something bordering on fear. "I think you should read it." Emily hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers stiff with dread. The handwriting was the same as the note she had received, the same sharp, slanted letters. But this time, the message was different. "You are not as safe as you think. Dig too deep, and you'll end up just like her." Her breath caught in her throat. Just like her? Emily's mind raced back to the old newspaper clipping, the woman who had died years ago, the whispers of Richard's involvement. Had this note been meant for Vanessa, or was someone using her to send Emily another warning? When she looked up, Vanessa was watching her closely, her eyes searching for a reaction. "You know something, don't you?" Vanessa asked, crossing her arms. "I saw the way your face changed when you read that. I don't know what's going on, but I know it's not just about me." Emily had spent her life mastering the art of deception, but at this moment she wasn't sure what to say. If Vanessa was being dragged into this, it meant one of two things. Either she knew more than she was letting on, or someone wanted to make sure Emily stopped looking for the truth. And the worst part? She wasn't sure which was more dangerous. Then, as if the universe was conspiring against her, Daniel walked into the room, his tie loosened, his phone pressed to his ear. His presence sent a jolt of panic through Emily. Had he heard any of their conversation? But his focus was elsewhere. His face was tight with frustration as he paced near the window, barely acknowledging them. "I don't care what it takes," he muttered into the phone. "Find out who accessed those records and make sure they don't do it again." Emily froze. Records? Access? The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. What was he trying to keep hidden? And more importantly, who had been looking? She exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa, who had clearly caught the same thing she had. If Daniel was covering something up, then he wasn't just an unsuspecting husband anymore. He was a part of whatever was happening. And if Emily wasn't careful, she might be the next one to disappear. But before she could think, before she could even process what her next move should be, her phone vibrated on the counter. A single message flashed across the screen from an unknown number. "You should have listened. Now it's too late." Emily's hands went cold. The game was no longer about keeping secrets. It was about survival, and she was running out of time. The weight of the message settled over Emily like a lead blanket, suffocating and absolute. She read it again, hoping she had misunderstood, that her mind was twisting things into something worse than they were. But there was no mistaking the intent behind those words. "You should have listened. Now it's too late." Too late for what? For stopping? For running? For surviving? A deep, nauseating sense of dread curled in her stomach as she looked around the kitchen, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. Vanessa was still staring at her, waiting for an explanation, but Emily couldn't bring herself to speak. Daniel was near the window, still murmuring into his phone, his back turned to them. He had no idea that with just a single message, Emily's entire reality had shifted. The walls of the house no longer felt like a barrier keeping the outside world at bay. They felt like a trap, closing in on her. She needed air. She needed space. Without a word, she grabbed her phone and rushed toward the front door, barely hearing Vanessa call after her. As she stepped onto the porch, the late afternoon sun did little to warm the chill, settling into her bones. She scanned the street, her eyes flicking from one parked car to the next, half expecting to see someone sitting behind the wheel, watching. But the neighborhood looked as it always did, quiet, normal, undisturbed. And yet, nothing felt normal anymore. Then she saw it. Across the street, at the edge of the neighbor's driveway, a black sedan sat idling. Its windows were tinted, dark enough that she couldn't make out a face inside, but she knew someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath quickening as a war waged in her mind. Was she imagining this? Was she letting paranoia get the best of her? Or was this exactly what it looked like? The decision was made for her when, as if sensing her scrutiny, the car pulled away, moving slowly, deliberately, as if taunting her. Not speeding off, not escaping, just a quiet, measured retreat. Emily's fingers tightened around her phone. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was following her. She forced herself to breathe, to think. She couldn't go back inside, not yet. She needed to clear her head, to figure out her next move, before she let panic consume her completely. The safest place she could think of was somewhere public, somewhere she could blend in. Without hesitation, she headed to her car, glancing over her shoulder once more before getting in. As she pulled out of the driveway, she half expected the sedan to reappear in her rearview mirror, but the road remained empty. It didn't make her feel any better. Whoever was behind this, they didn't need to follow her openly anymore. They had already made their point. She drove aimlessly for nearly 20 minutes, her mind racing, her thoughts looping in frantic circles. Every possibility felt worse than the last. Had Richard discovered that she was digging into his past? Had Daniel? Or was it someone else entirely, someone she hadn't even considered? The deeper she fell into this mystery, the more she realized she had no idea who to trust. She pulled into a crowded coffee shop parking lot, forcing herself to take slow, steady breaths before stepping inside. The scent of roasted coffee beans and baked goods did little to calm her, but at least she was surrounded by people. She ordered something she didn't want, just for the sake of keeping her hands busy, then found a seat in the corner, facing the entrance. She needed time to think, to sort through everything, to figure out her next move. But just as she took her first sip, her phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. Another message. "You're not as alone as you think." Emily's hands shook as she lowered the cup, scanning the caf, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had chosen this place because it was crowded, because she thought it would make her feel safe. But now, surrounded by strangers, she realized the horrifying truth. Whoever was watching her, they were already here. Emily's breath came in shallow, uneven waves as she clutched her phone, scanning the caf with frantic eyes. Every face around her seemed suspicious, now the man tapping at his laptop, the woman stirring sugar into her coffee, the barista taking orders behind the counter. Any one of them could have sent that message. Any one of them could have been watching her this whole time. The weight of the realization pressed down on her, suffocating, inescapable. She had spent so much time looking over her shoulder, so much time trying to outmaneuver whoever was pulling the strings. But now she knew she wasn't ahead of them. She had never been ahead of them. They had been inside her world from the very beginning. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, the urge to call someone, anyone, screaming inside her mind. But who? Vanessa, the only person who had shown even a shred of honesty in the past 24 hours. Daniel, who was clearly hiding something. The police? But what could she even say? That someone had been following her, leaving cryptic messages? That she thought she was in danger, but had no real proof? No, that wasn't an option. She was on her own in this. Then, just as she was about to force herself to move, a shadow fell across her table. "I was hoping I'd find you here." Emily looked up so quickly, she nearly knocked over her coffee. Standing in front of her was someone she hadn't expected to see, at least, not like this. Richard Carter, her father-in-law, the man she had been unraveling piece by piece over the past few days. The man who, according to every sign she had uncovered, was at the center of something far more sinister than she could comprehend. He looked perfectly composed, dressed in one of his usual tailored suits, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression calm. Too calm. Her stomach twisted. "Richard," she managed, trying to mask the alarm in her voice. "What are you doing here?" He slid into the seat across from her, unbothered by her tension. "I should be asking you the same thing. You've been very busy lately, haven't you?" His tone was casual, but there was something sharp beneath it, something deliberate. Emily's pulse thundered. He knew. He knew everything. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." Richard gave a slow, knowing smile. "Emily, you're smarter than that. And I certainly didn't raise my son to marry a woman who plays dumb." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You've been asking questions, digging where you shouldn't. You really should have listened to the warnings." Emily's body went rigid. The warnings. The notes. The missing footage. The car outside her house. Every piece of the nightmare she had been living suddenly pointed to the man sitting right in front of her. She had suspected him from the beginning, but to hear him acknowledge it, to watch him sit here so unshaken, made her stomach churn. She swallowed hard. "What do you want?" Richard sighed, as if she had disappointed him. "To help you, Emily. To tell you something you should have figured out on your own by now." He paused, studying her face. "You think you're the one uncovering secrets. You think you're the one who's been betrayed." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "But you have it all wrong. The real question you should have been asking is who has been lying to you from the very beginning." Emily opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because in that moment, something shifted in her mind. A memory surfaced, one she had ignored before, but now, under Richard's scrutiny, it clawed its way to the front. Daniel's missing phone, his hushed conversations, his insistence on keeping her away from certain details, the way Vanessa had looked at her earlier, as if she expected Emily to already know something, the records Daniel had been trying to keep hidden, the way he had entered the kitchen that morning, muttering about making sure they didn't find out. The world around her seemed to tilt. The pieces realigned themselves in an entirely new shape, one she hadn't seen before. It wasn't Richard she should have been looking at. It was Daniel. Richard watched her closely, reading every flicker of realization on her face. "Now you see it, don't you?" he said softly. "You were never the one in control of this game. Daniel always was." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Because deep down, despite everything, despite the warnings, despite the fear, she had believed Daniel was just as lost as she was. That whatever secrets their family held, he was simply another victim of them. But what if he wasn't? What if he had been playing her this entire time? Richard leaned back, satisfied. "Be careful, Emily. You're asking all the wrong questions. And if you're not careful, you might not like the answers." And with that, he stood, smoothed out his suit, and walked away, leaving Emily sitting in a storm of doubt, betrayal, and the terrifying realization that she might have just spent all this time running from the wrong person. Emily sat frozen, Richard's words ringing in her ears like a siren she couldn't shut off. Every instinct told her not to believe him, not to let him manipulate her, but the doubt had already taken root, burrowing into her thoughts, unraveling everything she thought she knew. Daniel always was. She wanted to reject it, to push the idea away, but then the memories started hitting her like a relentless tide. The missing records, the cryptic phone call, the look Vanessa had given her, the way Daniel had been trying so hard to keep her from asking questions. Had she really been so blind? Had she been sleeping next to the real threat this entire time? Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone, scrolling through her messages, looking for something, anything that might prove Richard wrong. But with every missed call, every unanswered text from Daniel that suddenly seemed too perfectly timed, her stomach twisted tighter. And then she saw it. A message she had ignored earlier in her panic, buried between a dozen others. It wasn't from an unknown number. It wasn't a threat. It was from Vanessa. "We need to talk. Alone. I know what Daniel did." Emily's breath caught. The words sat there on the screen, like a loaded gun, waiting for her to pick it up. She had been so focused on Richard, on the notes, on the figure in the dark, that she hadn't even considered what Vanessa might know. And now, as she stared at the message, she realized she was out of time to keep avoiding the truth. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady as she pushed through the crowded cafe, her mind spiraling through the worst possible scenarios. If Vanessa knew something, it meant the danger wasn't just a theory anymore. It was real, and Emily was walking straight into it. Vanessa had sent an address, one that led Emily to a stretch of old houses on the edge of town, where the streetlights flickered and the sidewalks were cracked with neglect. It wasn't the kind of place Vanessa would normally be. She was too cautious, too put together, but maybe that was the point. Emily parked a block away, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, trying to gather the courage to step out. If Daniel had really been lying to her, if he had been playing her this entire time, what was she about to walk into? She knocked once, twice. Then the door creaked open, revealing Vanessa, her face pale, her dark eyes darting past Emily as if checking to make sure she hadn't been followed. She yanked Emily inside without a word, locking the door behind her. The air inside was thick with unease, the living room dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. Vanessa didn't waste time. "You need to leave him," she said, her voice sharp, urgent. Emily's pulse jumped. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa exhaled, pacing, running a hand through her hair. "Daniel isn't who you think he is. He's been keeping things from you, from all of us." She hesitated, swallowing hard before finally looking Emily in the eye. "I think he killed her." The room tilted. The air left Emily's lungs in a rush. She knew exactly who Vanessa meant. The woman from the past, the one who had died under mysterious circumstances. The story Emily had been chasing, the one she had believed led back to Richard. But now, standing here, staring at Vanessa's panicked face, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's not possible," she whispered, shaking her head. "Daniel, he wouldn't." "You don't know him," Vanessa cut in. "Not like I do. I found something, Emily. A file. Records from that night. Witness statements, inconsistencies in the reports. Someone covered it up. And Daniel, he's the only one who had access to all of it." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You were looking in the wrong place. Richard is a bastard, but this wasn't him." Emily's mind was spiraling, the weight of it all pressing down on her like she was drowning. She wanted to deny it, to believe that Vanessa was wrong, that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But deep down, she already knew. The signs had been there, buried under love, under trust, under years of believing Daniel was the only person in the world who would never betray her. And now, it was all crumbling. Vanessa grabbed her arm, her fingers digging in. "Listen to me. He knows you've been asking questions. If he thinks you're close to the truth, he won't let you walk away from this. You need to leave. Tonight?" Emily felt the walls closing in. Leave? Just walk away from her life, from everything she thought she knew. Was that even an option? If she confronted Daniel, she had no idea how he would react. But if she ran, she might never get the answers she needed. The truth had been right in front of her this entire time, and now she had a choice: protect herself, or finally uncover the whole, horrifying story. And the worst part? No matter what she chose, she wasn't sure she would make it out alive. Emily's heart pounded as Vanessa's words echoed in her mind. You need to leave. Tonight. But how could she just run when the truth was still out there, tangled in layers of deception? Every instinct screamed at her to get out, to disappear before it was too late. But something stronger, something desperate kept her rooted to the spot. She had spent too much time being lied to, too much time chasing shadows. If she left now, she might never know how deep this went. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to think. Tell me everything, she demanded. Vanessa hesitated, then grabbed a folder from the table and shoved it into Emily's hands. I stole this from Daniel's office, she admitted, her voice laced with guilt. I thought I was imagining things at first, that I was seeing connections where there weren't any. But then I found this. Emily flipped through the pages, her stomach twisting at the contents. They weren't just about the woman who had died. There were records, financial transactions, property deeds, offshore accounts, all leading back to Daniel and his father. But what chilled her most was the list of names. Dozens of them. Some she recognized, lawyers, business partners, local officials. Others were unfamiliar. But they all had one thing in common: they were marked. Some crossed out, others highlighted. And at the very bottom of the page was her own name. A wave of nausea hit her. "What is this?" she whispered. Vanessa swallowed hard. "It's a list of people who got too close to the truth. Some of them took bribes. Some of them disappeared." Her voice dropped lower. "And some of them turned up dead." Emily's fingers tightened around the pages. The conspiracy wasn't just about one affair, one murder. This was bigger, so much bigger. She thought she had been investigating a crime that had torn apart a family, but this was a network of corruption, of cover-ups spanning years. And Daniel had been in the center of it all. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Emily's breath hitched as Vanessa's eyes widened in terror. Neither of them moved. Then another knock, heavier this time, and a voice that sent ice through Emily's veins. "Emily, open the door." "Daniel." She clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. He shouldn't be here. He wasn't supposed to know she was meeting Vanessa. Unless he had been following her. Vanessa's hand gripped her wrist, her voice barely above a whisper. "He can't see me here." Emily's mind raced. If Daniel had been watching her, if he knew she was getting close, then this wasn't just a conversation. It was a trap. The doorknob rattled. "Emily, I know you're in there." His voice was steady, calm, too calm. "We need to talk." Vanessa squeezed her hand one last time before slipping toward the back door, her silent message clear: do not trust him. Emily steeled herself, forcing her shaking hands to still before unlocking the door. Daniel stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room before settling on her. He looked the same as always, charming, composed, but now, every smile, every reassuring touch she had ever known felt like a mask. "I was worried about you," he said, closing the door behind him. "You haven't been answering my calls." Emily swallowed hard. "I needed time to think." Daniel nodded, stepping closer. "Too close." "I get that. I do. But I need you to trust me, Em." His gaze flickered toward the table, where the folder had been a moment ago. "What were you talking about with Vanessa?" Her stomach clenched. He was fishing. He knew something, but not everything. "She had one chance to play this right. She wanted to warn me about Richard," she lied, watching his reaction carefully. "She said I should be careful around him." Something flickered behind his eyes, but it was gone just as fast. "Richard's dangerous," Daniel admitted, reaching for her hand. "That's why I've been trying to protect you." His grip was gentle, but his fingers were ice cold. "I need you to come with me. We'll go home, figure this out together." A sickening realization hit her. He knew. He knew she had seen too much, and now he was trying to pull her back in. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "And if I don't?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, in the softest, most chilling voice she had ever heard, he said, "Then I can't promise what happens next." The room spun. Every doubt, every lingering hope that this was all some misunderstanding shattered in an instant. Daniel wasn't a victim of his family's sins. He wasn't being manipulated or used. He was part of it. And now, she was trapped. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at Daniel, his chilling words settling over her like a death sentence. "Then, I can't promise what happens next." It was a confession, wrapped in a threat, and in that moment she knew there was no more pretending, no more hoping she had been wrong. He wasn't the man she thought he was. He never had been, but she couldn't let him see her fear. Not yet. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to push past the overwhelming urge to run. He was too close, watching her every movement, waiting for a misstep. If she showed even a flicker of panic, he would know she wasn't playing along anymore. She swallowed hard. "I just need time," she whispered, keeping her voice even. "This is a lot, Daniel. I don't know what to believe." His expression softened just enough, a calculated move to pull her back in. That's why we need to leave together, he urged, stepping closer. Away from all the noise, all the people filling your head with lies. Just you and me, like it was supposed to be. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Vanessa was gone. She had slipped out the back, but Emily didn't know if she had made it far enough. And now, she was alone with him, with no one to witness what was about to happen. She needed a way out. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, searching, grasping until they found something solid: her car keys. She curled them into her palm, careful not to make a sound. "Okay," she said, nodding slowly. "Let's go." Daniel's eyes flickered with satisfaction. He believed her. That was her only advantage now. She let him lead her outside, into the cold night air, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had to make a move before they reached the car, before he had complete control. Her heart pounded as she glanced around the empty streets, searching for an opening. But then, a sound. Footsteps. Emily barely had time to process it before a figure emerged from the shadows. Richard. Daniel tensed immediately, his grip on her arm tightening. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked between them, settling on Emily, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "I should have known you'd try to get to her first." Emily's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Daniel scoffed. "Ignore him. He's trying to manipulate you." "Daniel is the one who's been lying to you," Richard interrupted. "But you already know that, don't you? That's why you're scared." He turned his attention back to Daniel. "It's over. The evidence Vanessa found? It's not just going to disappear." Emily's breath hitched. Vanessa got away. She made it. But Daniel only smirked, shaking his head. "You always did underestimate me, Richard." His voice was calm, too calm. "You think I didn't prepare for this?" Then, before Emily could react, Daniel moved. Fast. A glint of metal, a gun appeared in his hand, and in an instant, it was pointed at Richard's chest. Emily's world slowed to a crawl. Her body moved before she could think, adrenaline surging through her veins. She lunged, grabbing Daniel's wrist with both hands, shoving it upward just as he pulled the trigger. A deafening bang shattered the night air, the shot missing its mark by inches. Richard reacted just as fast, tackling Daniel to the ground with a force that sent them both sprawling. The gun skidded across the pavement, landing near Emily's feet. Her breath hitched as she stared at it, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. Daniel was stronger, fueled by desperation. He threw Richard off him, scrambling to his feet, his eyes wild. And that's when Emily saw it, the shift in his expression, the sharp flicker of realization. He knew it was over. But he wasn't going down alone. His gaze snapped to Emily, to the gun in her hands. Time seemed to freeze. She could feel the cold metal pressing into her palm, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Daniel took a slow step toward her, his voice soft, coaxing. Put it down. You don't want to do this." But he was wrong, because she did. She lifted the gun, her hands shaking, her mind racing back through every lie, every manipulation, every moment he had stolen from her. She had spent so much time questioning herself, doubting her instincts. "Not anymore." "I loved you," she whispered, her voice raw. Daniel's expression didn't change. He wasn't afraid. He still thought he had control. "And you still do," he said, taking another step. "That's why you won't pull the trigger." But then, a siren. Flashing lights flooded the street. Tires screeched. Voices shouted. Police. Emily barely had time to process it before Daniel moved, his body tensing like a spring, about to snap. But this time, he wasn't fast enough. Richard tackled him again, harder, pinning him just as the officers swarmed in. It was chaos: shouts, flashing lights, handcuffs snapping into place. But all Emily could do was stand there, frozen, staring at the man she had once trusted with everything as he was dragged away. And then, just as he was being shoved into the back of a squad car, Daniel turned to her and smiled. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defeat. It was something worse. It was a promise. Emily's blood ran cold. She had won for now. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The web of secrets she had uncovered was bigger than just Daniel. There were others, and they were still out there. And as the car disappeared into the night, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She would never be safe. The days blurred together after Daniel's arrest, but the weight of everything he had done, everything Emily had uncovered, never faded. Even after the police confirmed Vanessa's evidence was enough to build a case against him, even after the media latched onto the story, twisting it into headlines that barely scratched the surface of the truth, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The trial was months away, and with Daniel's connections, there was no guarantee he wouldn't find a way to slip through the cracks. The thought haunted her, but what terrified her more was the deeper conspiracy she had glimpsed the names on that list, the ones still walking free. Some had already gone silent, disappearing before the police could even reach them. Others had the kind of power that ensured their names would never be spoken in court. The system was built to protect people like them, and Emily knew it. She spent hours poring over the documents, trying to piece together what had been hidden for so long. Richard had been right. Daniel was just one part of something larger, something that had operated in the shadows for years. And yet, no matter how much she uncovered, there were still gaps, pieces missing, evidence that had been carefully erased. It made her wonder who else had tried to expose the truth before her. How many people had ended up as just another name on that list? The thought made her stomach turn. For every bit of justice Daniel's arrest brought, there was another truth lingering beneath the surface, one that no courtroom would ever touch. The world outside moved on faster than she expected. News cycles shifted, and the sensationalism of the case was quickly overshadowed by the next scandal, the next headline. But Emily couldn't move on. She still felt his presence, Daniel's last words, that smile, that promise. She saw him in every shadow, in the way strangers lingered too long in her periphery. It was paranoia, she told herself. But was it? If Daniel had spent years weaving lies, controlling every part of his life, why would prison be the thing that stopped him? He had built something, a network, a legacy of secrets. People like him didn't just disappear. The nightmares started soon after. Sometimes she was running, trapped in endless hallways, with doors that led to nowhere. Other times, she was back in that moment, standing in the street with the gun in her hands, Daniel walking toward her, daring her to pull the trigger. But no matter how the dream played out, it always ended the same way. She would hesitate, and then he would smile. Richard checked in from time to time, though neither of them spoke much about what had happened. There was nothing left to say. They both knew Daniel's arrest was only the beginning, not the end. Vanessa had gone into hiding, terrified that the people she had exposed would come after her next. And Emily? She wasn't sure where she stood anymore. She had spent so much time chasing the truth, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure what to do with it. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, staring at the case files scattered across her kitchen table, her phone buzzed. A restricted number. Her stomach twisted. She knew she shouldn't answer. She answered anyway. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice low, familiar, and far too calm. "You should have pulled the trigger, Em." Her breath hitched. "Daniel." A click. The line went dead. Emily sat there, frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear. The walls of her apartment suddenly felt too thin, the air too still. She turned slowly, scanning the shadows, half expecting him to be standing there, watching. He wasn't, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be. Her hands clenched into fists, her pulse hammering in her ears. He was locked away, but his reach. His reach had never been limited to walls.